How's my camera doing?
Oh, you look great. You look great. Looks like you've got something complicated going on behind you there. And
Yeah, I'm director of the Quantum Alliance Initiative here at Hudson, and we're working on an econometric study of the effect of a possible quantum computer attack on crypto. So I've got my team working on that. Fortunately, they've got a more extensive background in economics than I do. So what you're seeing here is the work that we've been doing, whiteboarding out what has to be brought into consideration when you're looking at what happens if crypto is brought low.
are you a crypto optimist?
As a matter of fact, I am.
Good to hear.
I are you? It's good that rings with you. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I do. I think that there's. I think the key reason is because people are beginning to realize the people who run the central banks are either inept or corrupt or both.
Yep. Yep. I'm beginning to wonder if my retirement is going to be there for me when or not that if it's going to be there, but if it's going to be useless. Useless.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an absolutely fair question. Um, or it is like with the Chinese, they move towards a digital currency, but it's simply in order to extend state power, not to your benefit. But
That's what's going to happen next. We're going to get a state coin, aren't we?
yeah, I'm sure, and they'll try to compete, but I don't think they'll be able to do it. What you're really going to see probably now is more of a wave of trying to regulate.
Yep.
I mean, that's already started with the people at SEC who are pushing for this. The chairman of SEC was, testifying on the need for. The problem with it is that if they do, then if they do try to regulate Bitcoin or Ethereum, then everyone will just move to something else.
Yeah, probably, no doubt. So why don't we get started with your new book, The Viking Heart?
All right.
I'll be honest with you, Dr. Herman. I'm just over halfway through. Very, very busy at work. I feel so guilty not having completely finished this, but I will, and I'm loving it. And it's really interesting and edifying. So,
Well, listen, if it's possible, if you'd like to do another one after that on the second half of the book, I'm always talking about my books.
thank you so much, Dr. Herman. So, why don't we just start out with a very generic sort of basic question for my listeners who, like me, don't know very much about the Vikings except for having watched the History Channel show. Who were the Vikings?
Who were the Vikings? Well, I think most people get the impression, and it's a correct one, that the Vikings were members of the tribes that inhabited Scandinavia in the ancient and then in the early medieval period. Scandinavia being the modern day countries of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and also Finland. But we usually think about the Vikings as playing a particular role in history, namely as the great seafaring marauders and expeditionary warfare experts of the Dark Age. And it's important to realize that among the Scandinavian tribes themselves who lived in an environment which was not very conducive to, should we say, to the easy life. I mean, it still is a very inhospitable environment. The very meager natural resources, very small arable land from which to grow food, to raise livestock or raise a family. And so seafaring, whether it's for fishing or for trading or for plundering your neighbors, including other Scandinavians, was an important feature of life long before the time that we call the classic Viking Age, which really gets started around 795 in the Christian era, with the first big raid probably by Danish raiders on the monastery at Lindisfarne on the eastern coast of England. Vikings never called themselves Vikings as such. They thought of themselves as belonging to their different tribes. And very much fixed into their local community, family and kinship groups. The word Viking comes from the word Vik, which means a creek or a river. So it has to do with access to water and using water as a means of transport, including over long distances. But it originally means Viking means to go be someone who's basically a pirate who preys upon neighbors. Again, not just non-Scandinavians or that we usually think about are monks or monasteries, or the English and the French. It also means on Danes and Norwegians and Swedes and the others. And it's only by extension that it comes to refer to all of those tribes and all the members of the tribes who are involved with it. But what we really, and I explain this in the book, that in those spectacular raids and those expeditions are really only a small part of how the Vikings, in other words, the Scandinavian tribesmen, spend their time and are involved in their lives. It's a way of supplementing income, is the way we would say it today, as opposed to a full-time site job.
So speaking of that, like in the book, you strike a note where you're simultaneously detailing the fact that the Vikings were these bloodthirsty rapers and pillagers with this kind of primal energy, but they also have this kind of noble spirit. You call the book The Viking Heart. How does that sort of savage energy eventually get channeled into more sort of civilized, productive ends over time?
Well, when talk about the Viking heart, and I really the book is about tracing its evolution over time. In other words, it's not like there's a set of cultural values or a skill set which is there with the first, Viking raiders and then, continues to exist unchanged through history. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. But you have to admit that the first key ingredients are, first of all, a almost reckless courage in the face of battle or in the face of voyages into the unknown. I mean, very often you've got these every spring, you've got tribesmen setting out in their longships, right, for destinations known and sometimes unknown, including, of course, eventually, as I explain in the book, crossing the Atlantic to North America. So you had this incredible courage, which their opponents always found daunting, and that made them really formidable warriors. A courage which probably reaches its most extreme form in the class of warriors who become known as the Berserkers, who are really, in a sense, so psyched up and hyped up in their reckless bravery in battle. The idea of it being that they had summoned up their animal nature, right, like a bear or like a wolf, who's sort of fearless to the point of almost frenzy in battle here. That's kind of an extreme example of that level of courage that we're talking about. But definitely the Vikings, in their heyday, had that leading characteristic that, as I say, made them really fearsome warriors and made them dangerous opponents. But also, too, what you see with them, this is an important ingredient for later on, is a commitment to the values of that hold the community, the clan, the family together. In that kind of an environment where, winter is basically 8 months out of the year, and if you're anywhere close to the Arctic Circle, we're talking about sub-zero temperatures for a large part of the year. The only way you're going to survive in this kind of environment is survival as a group. Everyone working together, everybody pitching in. And that sense of that survival of the group requires everybody participating, that everybody is committed and loyal to the group, carries over to whether you're talking about maintaining a farm or maintaining the village, or whether you're talking about sailing a longship or building a longship. Here, it's a communal activity. And that kind of loyalty, that sense of commitment, that kind of what we would call tribal sense of priority is one of the things that gives the Vikings their enormous strength, but it's also a kind of an instinct to support the group and work together as a group that carries over into later ages of Scandinavian history as well.
One thing I found myself fascinated by is I've been a lover of your books for quite some time now. I actually came across your book on the Scottish Enlightenment in Scotland when I was visiting for the first time. So you've written books on the Scottish Enlightenment. You've written about Plato and Aristotle, books about Gandhi and Churchill and World War II. What made you want to write about the Scandinavians this time? I know it's your personal family connection, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then what else was it beyond that?
Well, there is a personal connection. In full disclosure, I talk about the Scandinavian from the point of view of being the descendant of Scandinavian Americans. Both of my mother's parents came over from Norway just before World War I. On my father's side, his great-grandfather came from Norway in the 1850s, just in time to serve in the Civil War in a Wisconsin regiment and be wounded at the Battle of Stones River. I talk about this in detail in the book, as a matter of fact. But the trigger for this was always the prodding. Prodding I received from my mother's brother, her older brother, my Uncle Norman, who, when you mentioned the Scots book, when the Scots book was published and was a success, it was a New York Times bestseller, it was a bestseller over there. And so we were at an event, and my uncle sort of said, "Great, so you've written the book about the Scots. Now, when are you going to write about the Vikings?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I have to think about that. Think about what I want to say about them." Because at that point, I was really embarked, already thinking about my next book after the Scots, which was on the Royal Navy, To Rule the Waves, and about how globalization was shaped by that military institution, but which actually was the one that built the physical bonds of modern global system. Anyway, so I was thinking about that. It was in the back of my mind. My Uncle Norman being a persistent fellow, when Gandhi and Churchill, the book of Gandhi and Churchill was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, he said, "Well, that's great, but when are you going to do a book on the Vikings?" And then, years after that, when my uncle was in poor health, he was still wondering about this book on the Vikings. And I have to say that I think part of my interest in getting launched in this book about 2.5 years ago, was not just the proddings from family or interest, and also interest in my own family histories. You get older, you begin to think about these things, think about the stories and connections with it. But it was also because I came to realize that the story of the Vikings was a much larger story in a chapter in world history, that the Vikings were more than just simply the super warriors we see in the TV series, or we think about as the great marauders in Dark Age Europe, expanding across Northern Europe into Eastern Europe, across the North Atlantic, but that their story also resonates through the whole history of Scandinavia and also in the history of America, when the Scandinavian immigrants, like my grandparents, came over and brought a lot of that cultural skill set we were just talking about over to America and made it part of the American culture, made it part of what would shape America in the 20th century as well. And I had done a book called Freedom's Forge, which was about the mobilization of American industry during World War II. And as it happened, two of the main characters in that book, Bill Knudsen of General Motors and Charles Sorensen of Ford, were Danish immigrants, also Scandinavian Americans. And so all the elements began to fall into place of thinking about how I could put this together as a book that would be, as you're finding out now, is a book that the first part is really about the Viking Age, and about the Vikings themselves and their impact on Scandinavian history. But the second part of the book is the story about the impact of Scandinavian Americans in America, and that the bridge between the two, what connects these two worlds, hundreds of years apart, centuries apart, is the Viking heart, is that commitment to community, that sense of that admiration and respect for hard work, and also at the same time a belief that individuals have to be free to pursue their own path, to look for their own way forward in order to benefit the whole. That the formula of support for community, of community solidarity, doesn't mean uniformity. That individuals have and should be free to pursue their own path, because by doing so, they can find ways that in fact benefit the whole. And that's the other key ingredient in what shapes the Viking heart in the modern era.
So why don't we rewind a little bit and get back to some of the stuff in the beginning of the book. You're writing, by the way, and I was talking with a colleague about this. I have he's in our history department, and he says you are a fabulous historian. And one of the things that he loves about your work is that you are an excellent prose stylist. And I completely agree with that. I really like popular history, and to me, it's not an epithet or anything like that. I only read popular history, and so I value it very much, because I can't read academic history because it's too dense and it's too dry. So I just appreciate and just really was able to get into your writing. One of the things, rewinding a little bit, that surprised me in reading your book, and let me admit, going into this, I knew so very little about the Vikings. One of the things that surprised me was just how, when the Vikings were doing their conquering early on, how vast their reach was, how vast their expanse was, their empire was. It wasn't just Scandinavia or even Western Europe. Their reach was absolutely staggering. And I guess I'm asking, how did the Scandinavians conquer the world? Because I just could not believe just all the different places that they invaded, all the different places that they went, how vast the expanse was. No one had ever taught me that before. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. In other words, how did they pull this off? For 200 years, 300 years, being really we could really say the ruling force in shaping the history of Europe, and shaping the history of Europe from end to end. Part of it is that due to their nautical technology, and I'm also an historian of technology. It's one of the things I'm fascinated. It's one of the things I work on here as senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, is the history of technology. And in the case of the Vikings, they had two powerful technologies at their disposal. The first was the long ship itself, which was designed to be absolutely seaworthy and even suitable for crossing oceans, right? But also at the same time with a shallow enough draft and a broad enough beam that you could sail this into very shallow waters, and in fact sail it up river courses, which is one of the things that the Vikings did that made them such a ubiquitous threat, was the fact they didn't just raid the seacoast of England or Germany or France, or they were able to venture far inland up river streams, which is how they, for example, were able to besiege Paris, how they're able to besiege London, but even get further up than that, because the longships themselves were also of the size. They weren't, they were big, 100 feet long, but they weren't the kind of thing it was a kind of vessel that you could, if you need be, get all the crew to disembark, pick it up and move it for portage purposes. Extremely versatile piece of nautical technology, maritime technology. The second tool, however, was the square sail. Originally, these were ships that were powered by oar power only. Yeah, there it is on the cover. But when in the 7th century Christian era, when they add on the square sail, this gives them not only greater speed, but also greater maneuverability and the ability to cover great distances in speeds that their enemies and those trying to keep track of them are simply unable to fathom. And the thing we have to always remember about the Viking raids is the shock and awe tactics that they involve, being able to appear seemingly out of nowhere, to go just about anywhere that the water courses would carry them, and then attack, loot, carry away what they needed, and be gone before their victims would be able to pull together forces to try and beat them. So on the one hand, you've got the technology. On the other hand, you've got a division of labor. Because if you look at the history of the Viking raids, you can see that the three principal groupings, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, all follow different courses and move in different directions in their expeditions and in their forays into Europe. The Danes tended to go to the west, to the coast of England, and then down through the English Channel to Normandy, and then rounding the coast of Spain through the Straits of Gibraltar and penetrating really quite deep into the Mediterranean, getting as far as Athens, as a matter of fact, in their voyages and expeditions. The Norwegians travel even further west, reaching around the top of the British Isles, Scotland to Ireland. Ireland, in fact, for a long period of time, is really basically a series of Norwegian principalities ruled by Viking chieftains. And then from there, pushing further out to the Faroe Islands. And then, as I describe it in the book, making their way to Iceland, and then Greenland, and then finally to the coast of North America, around 1000 AD, making landfall and building settlements along the coast of what is today Newfoundland. The Swedes, their orientation is eastward, not westward. So their voyages and their expeditions go through the Baltic, across the Baltic, and then down the river courses of modern day Russia, the Dnieper and the Dniester and the Don, all the way down, in fact, to the Black Sea, and eventually reaching the capital of the civilized world at the time, in the 10th century, Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. And from there, over the next several decades, intrepid Viking traders are going to make their way as far as Baghdad and are going to establish trading routes that reach deep into the Middle East, flowing Arab silver up through the Black Sea, all the way to Scandinavia. So it's an enormous net that spreads out across here, thanks to that nautical technology, but also one in which the Swedes, the Danes, and the Norwegians all have their favorite routes and the ways in which they think about how to engage, not just in trade, but also, it's important to realize, eventually settlement as well. They're not just there to go from raiding to trading, they're also going to move in as settlers eventually.
So much of their journey, I had never been taught any of this. We hear so much about Alexander and Alexander the Great and Caesar and stuff like that, but rarely, I don't remember in school ever getting tracing where the Vikings went. But I did find it fascinating that they were able to get people to pay them to leave after they would invade. I found that pretty rich.
It's what we would call today ransomware.
Yeah.
That's basically what it is. We'll leave you alone if you pay so many thousands of pounds of silver, and a lot of places would prefer to do that. But eventually, as I say, the pillaging turned and the raiding turned to trading, and in no time, people realized that you could do business with Vikings in a variety of commodities. And that they, because of their far-flung trading routes and access, you can get access to a lot of commodities from faraway places that you wouldn't if you were trying to engage in trade overland. The other thing which is also interesting to keep in mind about these Viking raids, these are small groups. Unlike Alexander, we're not talking about large-scale armies in the thousands. Now, eventually in England, you will have large-scale military expeditions that are going to be built and based involving Viking warriors. But the voyages that we're talking about, the kind of ones that really, take our breath away in terms of the distances covered and the physical challenges involved. We're talking about, 20 or 40 long ships, each one carrying maybe 20 or 30 passengers, men and women. It's important to realize that too. Women went along on these voyages, were part of it, part of the expeditions, and part of the whole experience of being at sea for weeks or sometimes longer for some of the really long voyages that went with it, that they participated in. But this is all, it's all small scale enterprise, This is not a sort of top down affair where kings ordain, thou shalt go forth and conquer England, or go forth and conquer Ireland and establish a naval base there. No, they're setting out every spring and saying, let's go see what we can find. So there's an element of entrepreneurship that quickly carries over from just military raids and attacks into establishing business relationships.
Yeah, and that was part of the thing that was surprising to me, is that just learning that their reach was so vast and their influence so large. And we're talking about a people that come from these small, little, icy little countries who you document this throughout the book, who seem to be late in adopting modern methods and ways of doing things and technologies and metals, coming from these inhospitable places with very little land, as you mentioned earlier, with fewer advantages that other countries and peoples have had, and yet they still accomplished so much. I wonder if you could speak a little more to what accounts for the success that the Vikings and then later the Scandinavians have had. What accounts for their enterprising spirit? How did they get their Viking heart? Where does that come from?
Well, I think a lot of it is, as I mentioned earlier, it's the environment which forces you to be resourceful, to work with others in order just to stay warm, right? Or to make a living, whether you're talking about clearing a forest. So much of Scandinavia to this day is still heavily forested. Any kind of arable land that you can grow crops on and raise a family on, you're almost certainly going to have to clear it. And you're not going to be able to do that yourself. It's going to take a whole effort of a village, of a community, of a tribe even, in order to make that happen. Or whether you're engaged in making a living from the sea. Fishing, for example, which is still in Norway, one of the leading industries and ways of making a living is still fishing. It's still the case today, just like their Viking ancestors. All of these involve teamwork. All of these involve also a cooperation in which everybody has their place, everybody has their role in terms of being able to, in order to keep the enterprise going, in order to make it successful. I think the other thing we have to keep in mind too is that the early successes of the Vikings certainly had a lot to do, not so much with the Vikings' strength as it did with their enemy's weakness. Think of Europe after the death of Charlemagne, the era we call Dark Age Europe. No real strong central authority, no real defenses against raids of this kind, which come and go in a matter of hours, or even a couple of days. And by the time you're able to raise an army and advance to meet the threat, they're gone. They've disappeared. They've taken what they wanted and have vanished. So it takes a long time for Europe to develop the defenses it needs to thwart these kinds of raids and attacks. And as I explained in the book, one of those institutions is the institution we call feudalism. Basically, kings and rulers in Northern Europe learned the best way to handle this problem is to hand the issue of defense over to local authorities. You get a group of men at arms, give them enough land in which to make a living for themselves and their family, and to arm themselves and maintain horses and support troops, and let them deal with the threat at a local level. It's the best way to go about that. And so you subdivide your political authority in order to have effective response. What we would call today a rapid response force to deal with this kind of Viking threat. And eventually it works. You know, as I explain in the book, the feudalism does enable the Vikings' neighbors to find ways in which to deter their attacks, defeat them in battle. The Vikings were hardly invincible. When they faced a large, determined foe, they could lose just a battle just as well as anybody else could in medieval Europe. And that's also one of the reasons why the Vikings eventually come to settle down. I mean, settle down in a literal sense of settling and acquiring land and deciding, you know what, we've had enough with fighting. I think it's time to make a living, get a new start for myself and my family, whether it's in northern England or in northern France and Normandy, or whether it's in Ireland, or whether it's going to be further west in Iceland and Greenland and eventually in North America. But also settle down in terms of realizing that the best way to enhance their income, right, to get the wealth and prosperity that they need and need to bring back home and trade with the Scandinavians still at home. The best way to do is really trade. It's the most effective, and it's the one which is the least costly, not just in terms of lives, but also in terms of the expense of being on constant military campaign and constant military alert.
So why did the Vikings embrace Christianity, and especially like Eastern Christianity? Can you tell my listeners who may not know the story of how the Vikings came to eventually dump their pagan ways? Tell me about how the Vikings come to embrace Christianity.
Well, the most interesting story is the one, in fact, of the Viking rulers in Russia. And by the way, the term Russia, the name Russian, in fact, comes from the Vikings themselves. It was the Viking Swedish adventurers who came and who established rule over the Slavic tribes there and maintained a central authority, who were known as the Rus, which means literally the men who row, which is again tribute to their nautical skills and their maritime prowess. But eventually, the Rus ruling class began to realize that their own pagan religion, the religion that we know through the Norse sagas, the religion of Odin and Thor and the other Norse gods, around which very splendid mythology is preserved in the Norse sagas, that their neighbors had all come to embrace religions which seemed to be rather more advanced, a little more sophisticated. And so Vladimir decides that the way in which to deal with this problem, who's the ruler of the Rus, decides in the 10th century, the way to deal with this is to have a contest. Say, okay, I'm going to throw over the old pagan gods. Why don't you tell me, you Christians and Jews and Muslims, tell me why I should embrace your faith? And so the story goes, and it's preserved in the Russian chronicles, is that representatives of the four major faiths, Jewish faith, Muslim faith, Eastern Orthodox, and then also Christian Orthodox, Roman, what we call Roman Catholic now, all came to his court at Kiev to present their case, salesmanship, sales presentation on each of their religions. And the story goes that the first were the Muslims, who explained that there were certain dietary restrictions, including no alcohol. And Vladimir said, that won't do it all. We're not going to be able to live in a world without alcohol. So we're definitely not going to go with the Muslims. And then the Jewish sales reps came and gave their presentation. And again, the dietary laws seem highly restrictive and so on. Plus, you also had this thing, the Sabbath. It was just too much. So no, I don't
Oh,
think.
trust me, I know that. I grew up Orthodox Jewish.
Orthodox Jewish.
Bar
Yeah,
mitzvah,
it was just
kosher,
too many rules.
tzitzits. Yep.
Right, too many rules for that. So the Vikings can't. Well, we're not going to be able to make it with that. So then the Roman Catholics come and they talk a lot about celibacy and all kinds of the life of monkish discipline and so on. Again, I just don't think that's going to work. Vladimir decides, so he's not really sold on that one. And then some of his own members of his own court described the trip that they had taken to Constantinople and the great imperial splendor of the churches and the palaces there, particularly the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which is still there. Of course, today it's a mosque, but at the time it was the most important Christian cathedral in the world. And so Vladimir's impressed that this seems to be not only a ticket to a respectable religion and more into the cultural mainstream, but also one that promises other kinds of rewards too, as well as good trading deals with the Byzantine Empire, with the rulers of Constantinople. And so he opts for Eastern Orthodox. Now, that's an important story, not just because it's a fascinating story in itself, and certainly the broad contours seem to be true, if not some of the details may be enhanced, but also because it's a watershed moment in the history of Europe, isn't it? Because if he had accepted any of the other three faiths, if he had accepted, for example, Western Christianity, right, the Catholic Church and so on, the whole history of Europe would be completely different from that point of view. It's enormous, that break that separates Eastern Europe from the West is, I think, defined at that very moment by the choices that he makes about which faith to embrace here. Now, in the Western part, in the Scandinavia itself, the transition from paganism to Christianity takes a lot longer. It's a more complicated, more difficult process, as I explain in the book. Paganism, the world view that had been shaped around the Norse gods, takes a long time to recede in the face of Christianity and in the face of the Catholic Church. But ultimately, I think, as I explain in the book, explain in Viking Heart, ultimately we have to say that although it means the end to the splendid pagan mythology, which only survives then in the pages of Norse sagas, there are Christian values that come and become part of the Viking Heart as well. The value, for example, of compassion, the value of individual conscience. These are important social and cultural values, I think, positive ones, which become part of the Viking Heart, part of the Scandinavian mindset with the coming of Christianity. And I think it marks a significant advance, both in terms of integrating Scandinavia with the rest of Europe, but also in shaping the Viking Heart from a worldview which is very insular, which is shaped around the values and the imperatives of the community, and gives it more of a kind of weight to the role of individual conscience, individual freedom, not just in terms of reckless daring or undertaking great enterprises, but also in terms of your relationship with others on a day-to-day basis.
You talk in the book about the diversity of the Vikings, just how many different people you were able to tag with the label Viking. And you kind of use that to argue against this myth of the sort of this pure Aryan race that obviously crops up, especially in the 20th century, and then gets used by Hitler. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some some of the research, I guess, that you did to dispel that idea, and how the real history kind of debunks that idea as well.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, one of the most powerful evidence against the idea of that the Vikings' success and prowess was due to some kind of racial purity, that they were the originators of Aryan master race, which then spread, down through the Germanic tribes, out of Scandinavia into the mainstream of Europe, but which was, preserved in its most pristine form among the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Scandinavians. That's the kind of the narrative that racial theorists would create in the 19th century. But the most compelling evidence against it, really, in the end, is I owe to the scientists and researchers who've been engaged in DNA research of all kinds, both in DNA research as it supports archaeological work that we do on Viking sites to understand who was there, and looking at Viking graves to help to identify who these Vikings were, and how old they were, et cetera, tell us about their biological makeup, as well as their cultural makeup by what they're surrounded with in their burial goods. But it also helps us understand the flow of DNA patterns as a part of global history. And what the study of DNA has really done is really destroy the notion of any kind of notion of racial purity in any sort of way. And that includes for the Vikings themselves, that what we've come to realize is through our DNA work, and also from the evidence that we get from the Norse sagas and elsewhere about the Vikings themselves, is that what made up the Vikings were a set of cultural, not racial characteristics. And so on your average Viking voyage, let's say led by a Norwegian chieftain, there would be Swedes on board, there would be Danes on board as well as Norwegians, there would be English on board, there would be Scots, so one or two Scots would participate. We know that was the case with Scots who made it all the way to North America as part of the Viking settlements that were established there by Leif Erikson and his contemporaries. And likewise, too, the Swedish Viking chieftain, he's going to have Finns who were part of his expedition. He's going to have Slavs who were part of it, and members of the different Baltic tribes of the time. The solidarity that held the community together, that made a Viking voyage expedition work, wasn't that they were all blue-eyed, blonde-haired Nordic types. It was a commitment to a goal, a commitment to the success of that voyage, to which everybody would have a part and a contribution. And that, again, included women. And that's one of the other most important things we mustn't forget about the DNA research, is the degree to which so many of those Viking graves include women. In fact, probably the most interesting one is the Viking discovery at Berka in Sweden, in which the tomb of a Viking chieftain, which for years was assumed to be a man, the most recent DNA evidence shows was a woman, in fact. So it gives us a nice insight to the degree to which in Viking society, women took on a lot of interesting and active roles, including not only participating in battle, but in some cases, we would have to say extraordinary cases, actually maybe even leading the fight.
That is really, really fascinating. And you say something in the book, and I'm going to butcher it, but you say something to the effect of that the Scandinavians, something like they were comfortable with female power or something like that. And you begin chapter 7 by telling readers the story of Scandinavia in the Middle Ages and how it differs from the rest of Europe. And you talk about the failure of Norway, Sweden, Denmark after the twilight of the Viking kings to establish a strong royal authority, as you put it in the book, and how the Vikings started to retreat into this isolation that was bordering on dangerous. And then three extraordinary women step forward to save the Nordic kingdoms from oblivion and to transform Europe. Can you tell me a little bit about those women?
Sure. A little deep background first, and that is that always the backbone of Viking society and Scandinavian society afterwards was the freeholding farmer. And the freeholding farmer who has his 30 or 40 acres, who's got his family around him and his livestock, he's the participant in the tribal assembly, the thing, which many people have identified as being kind of a primitive form of democracy that was part of the Viking legacy and part of the Viking political system. That political power in Viking society really did depend upon the consent of the governed in a formal sense as well as in an informal sense. But the persistence of that freeholding farmer means that Scandinavia falls out of step with the rest of Europe, feudal Europe, in which the freehold proprietor, farmer, disappears, becomes an endangered species, and instead it's peasants, serfs, and peasants who are tied to the land, who work the land as a matter of obligation to their landlords, who are the backbone of the economy, just as their landlords become the ruling class, the ruling caste for Europe. This doesn't happen in Scandinavia. And the result is it kind of, in a weird way, falls out of step with the political evolution in the rest of Europe. To our minds, the survival of that kind of sort of, should we say, sort of a democratic framework, right? Free men and women who farm their own farms and so on, is a positive development. But in the course of European history, it's one that retards the development, political development around strong central authority. And the result is that a lot of the history of medieval Europe, medieval Scandinavia, as I describe it in the book, resembles a kind of endless Game of Thrones episode in which people are constantly backstabbing each other. There's a constant battle for succession and control. The place, it's one decade after another of kind of internecine warfare, of civil war. And then these three extraordinary women, as you put it, step forward to sort of remake the political landscape for Scandinavia. The first of them is not a political figure at all. That's Saint Bridget of Sweden, who dedicates her life to creating a series of religious houses across Sweden and eventually across Europe, as a matter of fact, and the rest of Scandinavia, the Byzantine order, who really is someone who really embeds for the first time Christianity as a kind of as a part of popular religion, popular life in her own native Sweden, but also outside of it, and who becomes an advisor to popes, who becomes an international figure, really, because of her piety and because of her kind of larger religious vision, and that is the way in which the life of Christ, the life of Christian values is something that we live, needs to be experienced as part of daily life. In terms of a daily household, it's a strong, resonant message in Scandinavia. The second one is Queen Ingeborg of Norway, who is able to, after her husband is murdered, is able to unite her kingdom and also bring about the unity for a brief period of time of Denmark and Norway as a united kingdom. And then the third and the most extraordinary who I talk about in the book, and that's Queen Margaret of Denmark. She's a really amazing woman, one of the most amazing women probably in the entire Middle Ages, because she manages to do one better than Ingeborg. I mean, Ingeborg got two of the three kingdoms to come together under a single heading. Well, Margaret managed to bring all three, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, all together under the terms of what's called the Union of Kalmar, or the Union of the Three Crowns. And until her death in 1412, she really is the kind of reigning figure. She doesn't hold the title herself. She always knows it pays to have a male in that position and for her to be the power behind the throne. But for the first time and for the last time in the history of Scandinavia, all three kingdoms become one and are, at least in a formal sense. And this is it's an amazing feat for one reason alone, and that is the fact by then, these have become three really distinct communities. I mean, the Vikings all spoke the same language, Old Norse, and they all had their different customs and, chieftains who ruled over their separate, local units. But in a sense, in a linguistic sense and a cultural sense, it was all pretty much the same. There was an homogeneous identity. By the time Queen Margaret comes on the throne, you've got a separate Swedish, separate Norwegian, and a separate Danish languages, and customs and laws. But the fact that she manages to pull this together and make the men obey and agree to the terms of the Union of Kalmar is an extraordinary feat of diplomacy and just pure power politics, which I think you really have to doff your cap to her and say she's a remarkable figure by any standard, not just by a Scandinavian standard, but by any standard that you want to hold up.
Truly remarkable. And so I just have one more question for you. And we've been talking a bit about women, and let's look at the other side of the coin. In the book, you say that the foundation stone of the Viking heart is manly virtue. What do you mean by that? Why is manly virtue so important? And here's the big one. How can we as a society recover some of that manly virtue? And what can we learn from the Vikings about that?
Well, I think manly in the sense of that, it was tested in battle. I mean, I think that's really what we mean here. And again, because of the Vikings had this great respect for women, because women had this important and active role, and we shouldn't see it as a separation between the sexes or the genders, that one is has a monopoly over courage or valor in battle or a sense of honor, and the other doesn't. They both did. Both are important for understanding the virtue of that kind of manly courage, ability to stand, ability to take risks. This is another aspect of it too. To recognize that the risks of an enterprise, of an undertaking, are worth it because it benefits not just you, but will also benefit your community, benefit your family here. That's an important part of the Viking heart, as you just pointed out. And I think it's an important value in any society that one has that, it's not one in which there's a kind of desire to, go with the flow in all circumstances here, that courage is a virtue to be respected. It's a virtue to be praised, and it's one to be cultivated with our young people, and to sort of say, and it doesn't mean in battle, of course, but it does mean being willing to sort of take a risk, to put yourself out there, to say, this is what I believe, this is what I'm going to do, and these are the obstacles I'm going to take on because it's important, and that I'm the one who, if there's no one else who's going to do it, then I'm going to have to do it. And you look at the virtue of courage in battle, more often than not, that's what it's about, isn't it? It's not that those who serve us on the battlefield in our military are ones who are like berserkers, who are just camped for a fight. More often than not, it's because they realize someone's got to do this job, and it might as well be me, and they undertake it. They overcome their fear. They overcome the self-doubt that comes into those moments, but they do it anyway. That's what courage is all about. And that is an ingredient that we miss out on when we just think about the Vikings as being, sort of super warriors who are ready to do battle at a moment's notice for whatever kinds of reasons. It's kind of the caricature we get from our TV series and from the representation in the media. But the truth is, these were ordinary people. It's one of the points of my book, really. These are ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And that's exactly the qualities and the virtues that we need as a strong society. And it's ones that I think in the era after COVID and all that's happened here too, I think it's ones we really need to think about. How do we get there? How do we cultivate it? How do we sustain it? Because so much of our future, the future of freedom, really depends upon it.
Beautiful stuff there. And if my Western Canon podcast listeners want to dive into some of the source material, the story, the Viking stories, right? What would you point them to, right? Because I think my listeners are well versed in reading Greek literature and the Odyssey, the Iliad, Roman stuff, but what should they dive into if they want to learn not just popular history about the Vikings, but some of that source material? Sure,
the primary sources here.
Yeah.
Too. And I think, in my view, some of the greatest books in Western literature are the Norse sagas. They are really not only great works of literature, but they're also highly approachable because they're in many cases, they're about ordinary people, ordinary human beings, and the problems and issues that they face living in this society, which places so many demands, physical, mental, spiritual, in the situations in which they find themselves in Viking society. I originally was trained as a medievalist, so I spent a lot of time reading medieval literature. In reading, I learned Old English, I learned Old French, the Song of Roland. I used to dream in Old French, as a matter of fact. Middle High German for the great German epics, poems as well. But I have to say, nothing really compares to the Norse sagas here. And I guess for your readers, the ones that I would start with is Eggil's saga. It's a fairly long one by that standard. It's about the size of a modern novel from that point of view, but very readable and really a nice picture of what it's like, what it was like to live in Viking society and the values and the conflicts that arise and how human beings deal with those values and conflicts as well. On the shorter side, I think the Finland Sagas, which is the story of the voyages across North America, first to Greenland and then to the Canadian coast. Very readable, very approachable. And then probably the most important one from the point of view of cultural influence has to be the Volsung saga, the story of the Volsung families, the dynasty there, which tells us the story of the hero Sigurd and his exploits, slaying the dragon Fafnir, his on-again, off-again fatal romance with the heroine Brunhilde, and so on. That's the story that Wagner picked up in his Ring cycle operas, and it's also the one that J.R.R. Tolkien will take up and dramatize in his Lord of the Rings trilogy. So if you want to understand the roots of our own modern myths, from Lord of the Rings to Star Wars, good place to start is the saga of the Volsungs. And all these, of course, are available in modern translations if you don't want to undertake the Old Norse.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive into all of that. And now you have me wondering whether J.R.R. Tolkien was basing it on that, and also I'm now wondering the Ring of Gyges story from Plato, because that's so similar to the, a guy puts on a ring and it gives him the power of invisibility. Now I'm starting to think that maybe it was that too.
Well, some of these are themes which we find, perennially.
Archetypal, yeah.
That's right. Joseph Campbell had pointed that out.
Yeah.
But there's a human factor. There's a recognition of the psychological struggles and conflicts that arise in these situations, that those Icelandic poets and chroniclers were able to record and give us insight into in those Norse sagas that no other medieval literature reflects. There may be other literature in other parts of world literature where we see it, but the Norse sagas are extraordinary works of literature. And gosh, in addition, if I can only encourage your readers to have a look after they read Viking Heart.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Herman, thank you so much for your generous time. And I hope you'll consider stopping by again when you write your next, obviously great book. And so just thank you. Thank you again.
I'd love to do it.
All right. I appreciate it so much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.